Hi, it's so nice to meet you. My name is Marcia Narine Weldon, and I really wish I could be there in person to meet with you. I had the honor of presenting to students and members of civil society and government at LUMS last year, and unfortunately due to COVID, I can't be there this year. But I'm happy to present to you my view of business and human rights and why it's my passion right now. So currently, I'm a lecturer at the University of Miami School of Law in Miami, Florida, in the United States. I'm also still a practicing lawyer, but I joined academia probably about in 2011, but I've never stopped practicing law. And I wasn't really thinking about business and human rights as an academic when I first came in. In fact, my interest came before that. I used to be the Deputy General Counsel, Chief Compliance Officer, and the Chief Privacy Officer for a company that managed other company supply chains. So I became very enmeshed in the intricacies of supply chains. I left that role in 2011, right around the time when the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights had come in. But before that, there were other things. There were questions about whether my company should join the UN Global Compact, which is the largest corporate social responsibility initiative in the world with over 12,000 participants in 100 countries. And there were questions about, do we really need to do that? We're more of a business to consumer company. We're not dealing with slaves anyplace. Why do we have to worry about human rights? So it gave me a lens into how certain businesses think about human rights. Now, the evolution and the definition of human rights has evolved dramatically since then. Companies now look at things like, quote, ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors. You have shareholders that do proposals about human rights issues. People look at the concept of data, internet access as human rights. I'm also passionately interested in blockchain, and the United Nations has a number of blockchain initiatives, basically looking at how do we deal with human rights impacts and how can we get money to people who need it? How can we get food to people who need it? So there's so many different areas where human rights and business can intersect. So I currently lecture on business and human rights in other courses, but next semester I'm going to be doing a business and human rights course that's really tailored to the business side of human rights because I come from a business background. When I first came into academia, I had to write law review articles and I wasn't even sure what to write. So I used my business thought and I actually went to the Democratic Republic of Congo for a nonprofit that I was helping to start. And at that time, there was a concept of looking at conflict minerals. Should companies be responsible or should they at least have to disclose where they're getting their minerals from if those minerals may come from mines that are guarded by rebels where rape is used as a weapon of war? This got me really interested in the topic because it married my knowledge of supply chains with also my interest in what roles do businesses have in mitigating human rights harms. So for the past several years, I've been involved in going to the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights in Geneva. Again, I had the pleasure of coming to speak to your colleagues at LUMS in Pakistan last year. And I also advise companies on business and human rights impacts. For example, just a few weeks ago, a company that I am a lawyer for, and I'm also on their ethics committee, raised concerns that they source from Apple and Samsung. And part of their business model is to sell Apple and Samsung phones. But there had been reports of tech companies, and particularly Apple, Samsung, and many others, knowingly or unknowingly using potential slave labor with the Uyghur minorities in forced labor camps in China. Public reports had come out, there had been public outrage, and my client wanted to know, what do we have to do? How do we deal with this? How do we find out? So I worked with them on crafting a letter that, number one, recognized that Apple and Samsung had made many public statements about its commitment to human rights, but that we needed more than that. And so looking through all of their public documentation and knowing what I know about supply chains and audit processes, I drafted business-focused letters that were meant to preserve the business relationship, but also to show that we mean business and we need to know how are they doing in terms of due diligence? What are they doing to audit? Are they merely taking the words of the people that run their factories? So that's an example of kind of how you can work as a lawyer for a business dealing with business and human rights issues. I've also helped them draft their human trafficking and sustainability campaigns. I've done that with many companies. But as an academic, part of what I want to do is make sure that my law students, and hopefully business students as well, really understand what the pillars are. When I teach it, I don't really spend a lot of time focusing on treaties because there aren't any treaties that bind businesses right now in terms of human rights. We'll get to that in a second. So when I start off the class, I focus on, let's look at this from the perspective of the UN guiding principles. How did we get there? What is soft law? Why does it matter? Why should business care about it? Is reputation enough to care about it? If in the absence of really forceful legislation, what do businesses do and why? So I start off looking at the general big picture, and I have students do an exercise simulating that they are the CEO or board members of a company. They know nothing about human rights, and they're faced with a decision to think about how human rights actually relates to their business. In the United States, we're not as developed as the EU, where they really focus on this in a much more intentional way. In the United States, we focus on disclosure regimes. Just let us know what you're doing. And we're not necessarily going to penalize you, just let the public know. That may not be the most effective way, but most business people don't really have a grounding in human rights. And what I want to do is I want to help lawyers who are going to advise businesses and business students, to the extent that they join the class, really understand what some of these issues are. We then go on to the pillars, the three pillars of the state and the company, and then the access to remedy. When we look at the state remedies, I want them to sit there and think about, how would you draft a federal human rights due diligence law? What would that look like? What are the competing interests that might come into place? So I want them to think about the process of lawmaking. We then look at the corporate duty to look at human rights and the duty to respect human rights. What does that mean? What does it mean to do no harm? What does it mean to do due diligence? And we look at a number of things. I make them, for example, represent a tech company and look at access to information, look at surveillance issues, look at facial recognition. And our products that are meant to be helpful, can they really actually hurt? And this is a real life issue. Just a few days ago, I sat on a conference call with the United States State's Department, with industry and with NGOs talking about surveillance technology and how to make sure it doesn't get into the wrong hands of governments that will be using it to find and round up dissidents, for example, or protesters. So this is something that's very current day. We then look more into human rights due diligence. I look at the Rana Plaza Bangladesh case study, and I go through that with a fine-tooth comb so that people can think of what are the different interests that companies have. I remember in my days as a lawyer, I had to travel to China and as a compliance officer, look at compliance issues and finding how people are treated in factories. What are the rights? Are there chains on the doors and the fire exits so people can't leave? Do they have the proper safety issues? All of those are human rights issues. From a business person, they think that they're just checklists from a safety perspective, but it's also really a human rights issue. We also look at the role of the community. What's the stakeholder view? What actual impact can stakeholders have? We look at NGOs. I have students act out and do a lot of role play in the class so they can get into the head. As a business person, I understand how business thinks. A lot of times people who want to do human rights work don't know how businesses think, and they tend up talking at each other instead of talking with each other. So I want students to get a well-rounded education. So we look at, for example, thinking about, let's go back to that Congo and conflict minerals issue I talked to you about before. What I often do is I have a simulation where some students represent rebels, some students represent villagers, some students represent NGOs, some students represent tech companies, some students represent government. And I have them look at the issues from the various different perspectives. Why would I have them think about being a rebel? Because in some countries, today's rebel is tomorrow's president. So you have to be able to know if you're going to negotiate, if you're going to set rules and norms or multi-stakeholder initiatives, you have to really internally understand the different interests of all of the stakeholders concerned. We also think about the issue of potential binding treaty. Should there be a binding treaty? There's a draft binding treaty. So I have students represent countries that they may not necessarily want to represent. Again, to get into the mindset of what is the resistance that a certain government may have, certain stakeholders may have to having a binding treaty on business and human rights. So these are just a few of the things that we look at. We look at human rights in sports. If we're doing, if I went to Brazil to do some research on this in terms of the issue of displacement of over 250,000 people to build stadiums for the Olympics that are never going to be used again. What does that mean? What about the role of companies working with countries and with militia or private militia groups to guard company resources? I visited Guatemala and talked to people there who had family members who were murdered by members of the military who were in fact working for a company to guard the mines. These were mines that were polluting the crops, were causing cancer and various illnesses. So does a corporation sitting headquartered in Canada or the United States have a responsibility for what's going on in Guatemala when in fact private security or militia are being used? All of these are issues that I don't think law students and business students really think about, but once they do, they get really interested. So I hope this has given you a bit of an understanding of what kinds of issues come up, whether it's sports, Olympics, World Cup, whether it's access to water, access to forests. How do you disclose? Is disclosure enough? If I just tell people we got our minerals from this country, which has uses rape as a weapon of war, is that going to be enough to get consumers to change their buying practices? Should governments do more? Should companies do more? What is the role of the company in society? So this is why I love business and human rights. And I do hope that you take advantage of any coursework you have. And if I can ever be of any help to you, my name is Marcia Narine Weldon, University of Miami School of Law, and you can reach out to me at any time. Thank you.